I think I'll start before the optics come over. Uh, so this is a very passionate subject for me. So I thought it is a good forum to present this in front of friends. I've known Dr. Parag for some time. The idea behind this session is to arouse a specific interest for people who want to predict the future. So I have a lot of interest in data analytics, and I do work a lot on data analytics. I do work on both hospital data as well as laboratory data. So the fortune of having data will make you predict. Right? As George Bernard Shaw once said, somebody asked him, what is the definition of an astrologer? So he told, a person who can tell you what is in store for you in the future and later can also tell you why it didn't happen. Right? So that was the definition given by George Bernard Shaw. So what I'm going to do now is going to give you a list of, a gist of 2 experiments that I did with data, right? Using the laboratory data that we have from my lab. And I will sort of try to showcase what is possible for all of us to do in the future. For many of you who have heard of data analytics or predictive data analytics, what it essentially means is if you know data, if you know the occurrences, and if you know the reasons for their occurrences, you will be able to predict a failure. Right? So the moment you start being able to predict a failure, then you know how to mitigate the failure. So this is typically what is happening in all fields. Now, the problem with healthcare is data is so heterogeneous. Particularly if you take hospital data, it is a very heterogeneous set of data. So collection of data is always a huge challenge. But laboratories, we are a little luckier because most of the analytical data is automated. So therefore, it is easier to get the data in one forum and try to work on the data, and that's what has helped us do these 2 projects. I'll just take you quickly through a basic introduction of what we do in my lab. I'm also a faculty at Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, so that helps me get access to these softwares. So it's a little software that can be used to do this. So in today's data-driven age, healthcare is transitioning from opinion-based to informed decisions. All of us know this, right? Today, no more opinions count. Informations are coming because they are coming from informed decisions, and it's completely based on data and data analytics. So analyzing the data reveals trends and knowledge that may run contrary to assumptions, because more often than not, whenever you have seen data and whenever you analyze data, you will suddenly realize that what you thought is not the truth, right? Like in my yesterday's session, I was talking about elimination of gut feeling. So many people ask me, what did you learn after getting through your data analytics? So I always tell them that the first thing I learned was to eliminate gut feeling, right? So there is no more gut feeling for me. If numbers tell me it's right, otherwise it's wrong, as simple as that. Okay, and then there is a shift in the way we decide, and therefore we can serve patients and healthcare enterprises better. So the idea is you have data, transform it into knowledge, knowledge to action, and action into the benefits to the society. So that's why we should be so consistent about data. The focus today and in the next 10 years will be data. And quality is strongly driven by data, not documents. So why the need for analysis? Obviously, because you need to enable healthcare providers, right? We are an important component of healthcare providers. Laboratories are a very important component of healthcare provisions, and it's very, very important that we are right. And when we are right, and when we are able to predict failures, and when we are able to predict disease, when we are able to predict occurrence of disorders, right, we'll be joining hands to the larger medical community. In fact, medical community will get substituted, right, with data decision-making tools, which will make their life much simpler. Because a large part of the medical community is taking complicated decisions within seconds without any data processing. So that objectivity will come in, and they will become more and more safe, because today we are having a very strong legal opinion about certain things. So once it is data driven, it becomes much, much easier to support that kind of data and support that kind of initiative. So normally, why do you do data work? You do because you want to increase your patient safety. Our results do have an impact on patient safety, care quality, cost efficiency, and the overall performance, right? Okay, so data in healthcare can come from qualitative and quantitative methods. Luckily, we fall here. Right? So we are mostly in the quantitative sector. Our analytical data is always quantitative. Okay, so how do you look at the value of healthcare? This is the question that should force us to understand why we are trying to do something. So how does one look at the value of healthcare? The value of healthcare is the quality of health divided by the cost of care, right? So what a person spends is very important. So that spending also will come down in some point of time if you actually work on data rather than on certain assumptions. So, and basically, laboratory data analytics virtually non-existent, right? Hardly anybody does any kind of predictions with respect to lab. So we will try to do some, analysis on that part. And then, but we have our analysis, mostly concerned with turnaround times, variance percentages, asset utilization, etc. is something that we normally do. So that has to be extrapolated to the next level. So basically the idea is we have automated reporting, both to internal and external, the EQAS and so on and so forth. Reduction in waste and care variations is our goal, which reduces the clinical risk to the patient. If you start forecasting, you will start forecasting failures as well as disease patterns, which will also help in population health management and ultimately lead to what is called as prescriptive analytics. Prescriptive analysis, you prescribe and say, this is what is going to happen, so let's get into this mode of prevention. So what does data do, or how does it feel when you're working with data? It normally feels like this, right? It is like the 6 blind men and an elephant story. I don't know if any of you have seen this fable, right? It's a very famous one. So this is how data feels. Each one of us will get a different perspective of the same data, and that's the beauty of data, right? Some may be right, some may be wrong, doesn't matter, but it involves that thought process and starts looking at, you can start looking at it from different ways. So from the lab perspective, I'm just going to discuss 2 things. One is a clinical decision-making algorithm. So what we have done in trying to possibly say that this is the possible disorder, so you need to do only these many tests. So this is like aiming towards preventing over-testing, right? You don't have to overperform tests, which is both to the patient, to the lab also it is a cost, and to the overall healthcare of the society it's expensive. So you can't do that. And the second one is, we have tried to come up with a model where you can predict the progression of diabetes and cardiovascular disease in individuals. I'll discuss that model in brief. Well, of course, in the hospital data, I have done some other projects. So what is the future for data science in the laboratory? So the idea is you can work on the metrics that fall into basically 3 categories. One is you can bring the cost advantage to the society, not an individual patient, because if you stop over-testing, right, a large part of the cost comes down. For example, there is a paper from the US Healthcare Economy journals which talk about how useful is a pap smear every year, right? So, and what is the cost? So they actually found out that the cost of the society cost, the cost that the society bears for conducting the pap smear every year, is much higher than the cost of treating it, if it is actually positive. So sometimes we do over-test because we have put in some algorithms within ourselves and trying to justify our own cause. So that is where data helps, right? So we'll put it in a cost, we'll put it in a process quality because you can start predicting your QC failures. You can start predicting your staff competency and so on and so forth. And then patient benefit, of course, is the ultimate thing that we all work for. So essentially, the first category should be laboratory and financial data, which I think one of the other speakers is going to take over. So therefore, I'm not going to touch on that. And then laboratory, financial, and clinical data you can put together. This is from an economic perspective. And then you can put in some, large scope that is for population studies. Okay. So one call that I always give to people when I talk about data is academic medical systems to recognize that the study, development, and use of analytical tools and big data can apply to laboratory, and people should look for it. Nobody is looking for it, but it's possible, it is there, and it can be done. And then as we make the use of big data to understand laboratory test utilization both ways, right? Both from a public to the lab and from lab to the public, right? Okay, big data is anything. Big data is anything that is large. Large, when I say, in terms of terabytes, in terms of gigabytes, right? More than 2 GB data is called as big data. The advantage of doing a big data analysis, it will give you a perspective of what is in the past and what can happen in the future, provided you know your occurrences in the past, right? For example, like we say, history repeats itself. So failures also repeat themselves. We have to be a little more careful. So if you are able to predict the failure, it's much easier to mitigate that risk. So that's the idea of doing big data story, right? Today, big data is an important word in clinical genomics, pharmacogenomics, because DNA data is huge. So people have to decipher that kind of data and then get into personalized medicine. Personalized medicine is possible only with predictive analytics. Personalized medicine is not possible with medical genetics. The know-how is there, but somebody has to predict to this person and say, okay, cisplatin is going to work here, etoposide is going to work here, then only it's going to happen. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. For example, as simple as aspirin. So the first case that I would like to share with all of you is this. We were trying to build a predictive analysis to build a model that would offer clinical decision support for results of primitive clinical tests. Very primary preventive health check tests, right? Very primary preventive health check tests like the liver function, the the cardiovascular function, and so on and so forth is what we did. So we took about two industries of people who came to us with a corporate health check, which like all of us do in different hospitals and laboratories. And then we did a descriptive analysis of their medical conditions. Guidelines that were followed included the AHA, that is the American Heart Association 2015 guidelines, and the ADA 2015 guidelines for the risk prediction. Because there is a clear risk prediction guideline given in those two guidelines. So, and of course the ATP3 guidelines for the lipid profile. So I can tell you what we did. So a detailed descriptive analysis was performed for particularly these three conditions. The idea was to see if these people are coming to us young, at about 33 or 35, and if you are able to tell them that this is your risk profile, and they start taking a certain amount of care about themselves, right, it's going to help a great deal, because India cannot handle this burden of non-communicable diseases that's happening. We don't have the kind of wherewithal to handle this. So in one way it's useful. The second way it's useful to clinicians is you can group all of these people who came together, right, and then start looking at it from a wholesome perspective, trying to give them more like a corporate advice, because that's also a trend that's happening nowadays, right? Many of us go and talk to the corporates and tell them this is what is your lifestyle and this is what is your disease profile. Third one is we started preparing what is called as a corporate health card. So you can say, 161 employees of yours were there, so this is what is the profile. So therefore, if you don't take care, then this is the loss you are going to see. Insurance companies were very interested in this data, by the way, right? Because their claim ratios are very important, right? So they were very interested in this kind of data. So, so what we found was the risk level for diabetes was about 26.1%. That means about 26 individuals out of this list had the potential of becoming diabetic in the next 1 year, right? So similarly, we had a risk of cardiovascular disease also around 16%. So which essentially means that if we are able to prevent, right, then these people will go on to postpone that risk. While we are not talking of disease, we are essentially talking of risk, right? Because nobody can predict the disease. So we are predicting the disease risk of getting that disease or disorder. So exactly the same way that we did for company B. So you will see that we have done a diabetes profile, a cardiovascular risk profile, and a hypertension risk profile. So trying to find out who will become hypertensive in the next 1 year. The reason we are putting a 1 year window is because that's the time when we are going to meet them, because this is an annual health check, right? So we are trying to put that 1 year window, trying to make sense out of it, so that when we talk to them and when we meet them again, we would like to see what's happening with them, right? So that's one way of doing it. So, and we also calculated the risk possibilities of multiple risks of these patients, that is diabetes overlapping with cardiovascular disease and any other findings in their health check profiles that happened. This is typically a preventive health check data that we had taken. So ultimately we have obtained a certain number of percentages which we gave as a report card to each of these individuals and to that company, and told them that this is what you need to do. So this data is as recent as November 2015. Right? So that's why I said ADA guidelines of 2015 were followed. So we are still working on some other databases with over 1,300 numbers. So this is one way of, so what did it do? Right? Basically what it has done is it has helped us stratify the risk, because the hospital knows that this patient is having this kind of risk, or this group of people have this kind of risk. At the same time, the family knows what is their risk stratification. Customer relationship management, obviously all of us look for it in some way or the other. Saving physicians individual interaction time, so you can put all of them together and give the same advice, right? Instead of trying to do a counseling one-on-one, you have to save time for everybody. So we actually did this right sitting in the corporate itself. Forecasting the occurrences of critical health risks, so people can take care of themselves. Of course, live healthy is a concept for all of us, so pioneering a healthy nation. And of course, long-lasting benefits, because once you know your risk profile, people normally tend to get careful, because we are in a country where we need a prescription to start walking in the morning. Right? It's so unfortunate, but it's true. Your first HbA1c of 6.3 will start making you walk. Otherwise, it does not. The first fasting sugar of 112 will start making us a morning walk. Otherwise, we don't. So we are so unfortunate that we require a prescription to do a morning walk. So in such a scenario, I thought it is better to predict. Right? So you can tell them you can still walk. It doesn't matter. Right? Okay. So this is the data. I mean, I'm not able to open it from here. So what this basically requires what is called as a cluster analysis. So this is one method of doing it. So you cluster the risks, you cluster the people, you put all of them together, and then work out these percentages. It's a very statistical modeling that needs to be done. So the same cluster modeling can be used for predicting QC failures. If you have done a thorough root cause analysis of the internal QC failures that have happened in the laboratory, and you are able to group them under particular root causes, say for example a new trainee, a reconstitution error, some whatever. I mean, let's look at all the root causes. You will be able to predict the incidence of your next QC failure, right, on any molecule. Anything. It's very easy. Basically, the statistics will tell you what to do next. And therefore, you can actually take care of it much before the QC fails, right? Whatever be the Westgard proposition, right? Whether you are following 2S, 1, 2S, 1, 3S, whatever it is. But as long as you are sure you don't want to accept the value, start predicting it. Right? So I have done that for creatinine. Creatinine is my favorite molecule. For those who know me very well, you will continuously hear creatinine. It's my favorite molecule, very steady molecule. So I have done that with creatinine, and we don't have QC failures in creatinine the last 3 months. Because if you do a proper root cause, you know the occurrences, and therefore you are able to predict its periodicity, predict its reason, and predicts the person who can actually do it. It's very, very easy to start preventing QC failures. So cluster analysis is one such method that can be done. Right? So I'm sure there are statisticians around who can help us with this, because even I'm not a master of this. Essentially, the idea was put all this data together and then ask somebody to solve it. And then in the process, we also learned the process. Right? We also learned the methodologies of doing it. So there's one more that I did. This is my favorite topic, the inborn errors of metabolism. So what we did was now, when a baby comes with an inborn error of metabolism, the clinicians are normally confused because the symptoms are, sort of overlapping, and these are rarer diagnoses, right? So therefore, it's not easy for them also to collect at one point of time and then say, okay, this could be Fanconi syndrome or this could be galactosemia. It's difficult, right? So therefore, you would want to substitute that very subjective thinking, because inborn errors of metabolism is a diagnosis of exclusion. It's normally not a diagnosis of inclusion. It's the last one that people think of. Once the lactate, ammonia, glucose, and all of things are done, then finally say, why don't you look at an inborn error of metabolism? That's the practice that's happening, and it's fair enough because they are so rare in their occurrence. So keeping that in mind, we thought, why not we think of a methodology to develop a algorithm which can predict what disease we suspect in that baby, where if the baby has reached your NICU, right? So done with the help of my neonatologist. So basically the idea is the same, right? So decision making towards a particular treatment regimen has to be adopted for individual patient, but it's a very complex process because doctors have to move from patient A to patient B to patient C to patient D, continuously keep changing their thinking profile also, right? It's difficult for them also. And then a large amount of information has to be processed in very short duration of time, which is very difficult, right? And much of which is quantifiable. Actually, you can put numbers to it, right? So that was the idea behind this. So, yeah. So the objective of this study was to apply data mining techniques, right? And do a classification, set some rules and put some classification, and trying to build a clinical expert diagnostic system for inborn errors of metabolism, which are the rarer ones, right? So we took 5 of these because we had a good number of cases for each of these. It's only a trial data that I'm showing you. So otherwise this is published. So fructosemia, galactosemia, isovaleric acidemia, propionic acidemia, and mucopolysaccharidosis were some of the diagnoses that we had in my lab. So we put up these numbers, right? Yeah, okay. So we tried any of these 3 methods to use this. These are again statistical methods available on softwares. You would have to just choose the software, and a statistician should be able to help you. So decision ID3 LRA ANN. I'm sure all of us have heard of artificial neural networks. Artificial neural networks are today used in the ECG machines software, the EEG machine software, and so on, because that's predicting your diagnosis based on the profiles that they have seen, and that's some lakhs and lakhs of profiles. They are put together and then say, okay, this variation means exclusively this. So that's how you are able to get printed reports from ECGs today, which was not the case earlier. 10, 12 years ago, it used to be the cardiologist or the physician who would interpret it and then say, okay, this needs this kind of approach or therapy. So this is basically the same kind of methodology, and all the algorithms were packaged. These are all softwares. These are all names of softwares. Okay, so the total sample size about 100 babies with symptoms but not proven to be inborn rates of metabolism, and some cases that were proven to be ultimately with the proper diagnosis were taken. Okay, so what we did was we created certain attributes to these children. The symptoms were taken, put into baskets. This is called as a method of binning data. So you put them into particular bins. So you bin the data, and then you create a bin for each of these data, and then try to put a certain number to it. Right? For example, if there is a GIT infection, so or a liver dysfunction. So for liver dysfunction, if the trans amino acids are greater than 1000, you can put it as 4+. If they are between 800 and 1000, you can put it as 3+. So you give your own grade. Basically, you can do that, right? So you can put your own grade to the data that you have, because this is again automated data. And after this, any other diseases you can put as a concomitant finding. Then, apply these statistical tools which we did. Data processing is faster than this. Yeah. Okay, so the best tool that we all use, I think this we use in clinical laboratories also, logistic regression for method validation or instrument validation. So same, you can use one of these tools. It will give you an R value, which we always use. So the logistic regression model was considered, right? Oops. Oh, we are getting closer to the beach, that's why. Is there some way I can do this better? Can you do it from there? If I say next? Yeah, that's easy. I'll keep my hands free also. Yeah, so therefore, there are basically about the decision tree classifier is one of them. Decision tree classifier requires gradation, right? For example, the 4+, 3+, 2+ that I talked about. Okay, next one please. Then there is a logistic regression which we talked about. Next one please. This is like I'm feeling 10 years ago I used to tell this. Next one please. Okay, so then multi-layer perceptron. So what is multi-layer perceptron? Because there are a lot of overlapping symptoms of these diseases, you can layer the symptoms of common diseases together and give them a gradation. That's called as multi-layer perceptron. Okay, next one please. Yeah, so logistic regression gave us an accuracy of classification with specificity of about 92 to 98% and a sensitivity of 97%, telling us that in case you are able to use this, right, you will be able to say that this baby is possibly having this, so test only for those, rather than trying to do a needle in the haystack situation where you keep testing and keep testing and keep testing, because you may not land on any of these so quickly. It's a very difficult thing to do. Then of course, ID3 also gave us good results. Okay, next one please. So this was the first report, then this is now published. So we did this job, this paper was one of the best papers in the IT healthcare summit that happened. Idea being to show that healthcare and IT can be sort of linked together if we can actually do it together. Next one please. So the conclusions that we did was, if you can actually refine this further, and develop it into a software or develop it into an algorithm that can be put and run on your servers, then it will be much easier for doctors to help diagnose the child, diagnose the case, and predict the future or predict the outcome of the treatment. Right? So that's very, very important. So predictive analytics is going to be the order of the day, and that's the future. Can you please give me one more slide? One more slide, please. Yeah, but the problem with data is this, right? So I guess that says it all. Thank you. Absolutely. The AHA classification 2015 has got, low HDL, they're given a risk score. LDL greater than 135, they're given a risk score. 100 is optimal, less than 95 is treatment target. Similarly, they have given for triglyceride, and similarly they have given for cholesterol. Now, there is no worry about total cholesterol anymore. So we classified only on those three. Similarly, with hypertension, what I have done, I will tell you. We have taken age groups of less than 55 and greater than 55, because after 55, a little higher BP is sort of, somewhere doctors don't tend to treat it too much. So therefore, we also didn't try to meddle with it too much. So we have done the classification as per AHA. And then diabetes, exactly according to ADA, where we have said 100 to 120 fasting glucose is one level, less than 100 is normal, and then 120 to 160 is another level. Similarly, for PPBS, we have taken 120 and above, 140 and above, 160 and above, and done the risk scoring as risk category 1, 2, 3. And with the same lipid profile that we are doing now, all of us do lipid profiles, you would be able to classify this risk. The simplest thing you can do, if not too much of analytics, is to just put it on a percentage scale. And suppose you have 130 patients who have come from one firm, right? So you can put it. If you want to do it for individuals, then you can say, because we know the progression of the disease. So the time it takes for an HbA1c from 6.1 to 6.5 with no therapy or no lifestyle changes, right, is normally about 18 months. So that's what is known. There are research papers. So we pulled that data from literature. So you could say in 18 months you could be diabetic and put it, right, and quote that. That's what we are doing now. So that's how you can create what is called as a health report card, rather than just handing over a report. So it's like a value addition from a consumer perspective. And for us, it is like you will be able to track this patient. Right? So this work is one such example.
Go to the American Heart Association website, and if you put the lipid profile value, age, smoker, diabetic, get a score.
Yes.
Saying that the next 10-year risk is 5% or 4%.
Exactly.
How can we do it in our own lab without going to the website? Do you have any formula or anything?
No. There is a they are also done it with the same software that I have done it here. The software is called R. The name of the software is R. It is really downloadable. So if you put it on R, it will give you the values. They have also done it, but it's on the website, so it becomes special.
Could we get the formulas?
Sorry?
Could we get the formulas for that?
If you go on to R, it will tell you what do you want to do. It will give you these choices. Do you want to do a decision tree? Do you want to do an ID tree? Do you want to do a multi-layer? Do you want to do only a risk prediction? Or do you want to just do a percentage classification? It will give you options. So you can opt for that and then create this database around you. Only thing is you will have to try. Sometimes it will go wrong. So you have to be very careful when you are looking at it. So that's why it needs some 100, 200 patient test data before you actually release a report.
What about hypertension?
Easily, sir.
Same,
sir.
same R.
Software R will tell you everything.
Okay.
But you have to put the data. You have to input the data.
And for that you require 100 patients data of your own. And for that you require
At least
200 patients data.
What I suggest is take about 200, 250 patients data already with you. Take 100 and put it on R and develop the method. Test with the remaining 100 to make sure you are okay. Because if you are being predictive, you need to be right. So for that, because you are sure of the current data that you have, use 100 for building and 100 for testing. That's one way of making sure that you are right and your clinical conclusions are matching. So it is possible, you can do that. One last thing. This story in healthcare started with a company called Target. Now, this is just an interesting anecdote I will tell at the end. Target was a company that used to sell, it's like any other store, like Carrefour and things like that, right? So they wanted to, and one of the key assumptions they made when they started the business was the time that a purchase behavior changes for a family, right? A family's purchasing behavior changes only when somebody is pregnant. Right? That is the only time when they explore newer brands, that's the only time when they explore newer products, and they want to try everything. So this was the key assumption of that marketplace. It's a hypermarket, like another brand like Carrefour or Walmart. Target is one more. So they wanted to predict pregnancy based on the purchase list of their grocery store. This is how it all started. Right? So whoever bought it, the one fellow used to sit there, collect all the copies of the bills, whatever they purchased, that's it, nothing else. Right? So based on that, they developed the ID3 algorithm which I showed you. Right? 87% of the time they got it right. So once they tested their data, the moment somebody bought a similar kit like this, they would send free vouchers home, which was related to baby care. Right? So this is how the concept of predictive analytics started in healthcare, that it can be predicted. 13% of the time they got it wrong, so it has gone to even teenage girls. Right? But that is okay, it was only a statistical correlation, nobody bothered about it. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Anand, I think it's something what Google does nowadays, that before the thing comes in your mind, it can search what you want actually. So it is something like predictive analysis. You must have seen, most of the times you start typing something and immediately you get all the options. So that's kind of predictive analysis. I'm extremely sorry I could not predict the failure of that remote. In the morning actually it had presented certain problems when Major General Bakshi was giving a talk, so we should have read the data which we did not read. So thank you once again, and I would request Dr. Milind Bhide to do the honors of giving memento.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Actually, why talent retention topic, that too by a pathologist, was the first question in my mind also. I want to be fair and honest. We were thinking about having some HR consultant taking this, you know. But when all of us sat through and felt, actually, all of us who are coming from whichever lab we are in, small, medium, large, so-called corporates, don't you think we all take care of HR? Yeah? And we don't know what is it which we should be doing. I have Dr. Parag here. We commonly actually sit across when we are meeting in our conference agenda meetings, and we are thinking how to take care and see to it that we retain our trained staff inside. Now there are various quotes and I think over time, with maybe last 15 years which I am associated with this lab, we have grown from one and multiplied. So with that multiplication, yes, the responsibilities have also multiplied. All of you are going through the same phase. But what I have seen or possibly I have found that yes, managing staff is a difficult task. It's like walking on it's not only everybody who is employed under you, and you don't like losing those people, don't you? You would like to have your own technician there or your doctor with you throughout, you know, but that never happens. Data analysis. Okay. So I have not made a PPT. What I generally do, I have started writing with time on my own, LinkedIn and all, and I felt that yes, this is something which I can do, so I volunteered. Now to come to the actual topic, talent retention, I wanted to write talent attrition, but I said let us be positive and write retention. So there are many quotes or if you look at Google, that's the common search engine, and when you write staff, there are common things, and I really believe in that nobody leaves a job, okay? People leave their immediate bosses because of either some not acceptable job profile. There are enough datas which are present, but I don't want to get into the datas and journals. Come to the gist of it. What happens is they have found that after extensive survey, they have seen people who leave jobs, you know, most of them don't leave because of pay or a pay packet. They leave because of problems like, if they have a job description, what we call in corporates JD, that's not adequate to what they want. Maybe they think they can do better, you know, or maybe their immediate boss, trust me, it is the only, if you have something called as exit interviews, they really help us to improve, which will be my last point if I have that time. It really makes you look into your own faults or organization as to how to prevent this damage further. And the third point what they have pointed out is interpersonal relationships. That means not the boss, एक टेक्निशियनच्या बाजूला दुसरी CBC आहे नाही, somebody is doing something else, she or he is constantly bitching, she is coming late. What I'm trying to tell you is no harmony into that particular department. And the fourth and the last reason, can you believe it, is the pay scale. So we always think, okay, थोड़ा ज़्यादा मिल रहा होगा इसके लिए. No, that's not the reason. So this is an eye opener, was an eye opener for us. I mean, at least when I am dealing with my staff, I felt yes, this is what I should look at. So how to go about retaining people? I mean, I will share my experiences. Please feel free to correct or add or tell me you're wrong. So when we employ a person, what you should look at the attributes of that particular person. Spend some time, and I think HR department, I'm glad there's nobody from HR here. If I'm doing it in SRL, there will be an HR head. But I think you should take, you as the pathologist or the microbiologist or biochemist, you have the right to choose the person. You should spend, it is an investment when you sit and interview that particular person and ask about, I think people say, let's keep personal out. I think no, I don't agree with you, because somebody may be going through a divorce, somebody may be going through a chemotherapy, somebody must have lost a parent, and that time you are going to tell them about punching the bloody card. It does not make any sense if you ask me. You have to be human to your staff. So I feel if you are employing a person, spend some time with the person, ask the person what is it which he or she likes. Like if you ask a person, she is good in possibly arranging events or organizing possibly seminars. If you have a marketing team, depute that job to her. That passion becomes her or his hobby. Okay. The second thing is give them the career growth. Okay, you are placed here, that's it. Yahi haroj karna hai. Nobody likes to do that. Do you like to make everyday dal chawal? No. You have a shift in pizza, pasta or whatever you have. So give them that growth chart. And trust me, not as per 15189, but literally give it to them. Show them, because in 15189 it is said continual improvement. Plan it. No. Plan it authentically and be true to that plan. You can say, this is this. I can give you an example. If you have a front desk officer, in a private lab, I think we coming from Lokhandwala, I mean, we have a small setup there. Rajesh is here. We have wonderful experiences. The major demand, all of you will agree, is the front desk person. How what do you call, human is your front desk person. You may be the best gold medalist sitting inside. Nobody knows. So I think when you are investing into a person and he or she may be an accountant, but if they are good in dealing with patients, they have personal skills, we can put them there. I'm just giving you an example. But what, always there, she retires there, I don't think anybody will like. Every year you just give her 8% or whatever your organization decides. So we can plan the chart. Later on she can become an admin, head of the front desk, promote, and the best part is not money, as I said, appreciation by the immediate boss. You have done a good job. If you look at the feedback forms, okay, if there is a negative, anyways the damage has happened. I mean, I always have seen if something your child or, I mean, I'm just going to the other kind of example, something has happened and you go and thrash it. Nothing, the child has already done something. If you don't do that, okay, whatever has happened has happened. Now let us stop at this and see why this does not happen. There are many examples all of us face every day or maybe once in a month, good labs. Okay, lab has opened late, the toilet was not clean, tissue papers were not there, syringe double prick hua. Aren't you seeing this? So what do? Ikde ya. Who is the technician? Let me find, she's already scared, or he. So I think when we are looking at talent retention, it is not the CEO or the CEO. All the people, right from the housekeeper to the reception, to your phlebotomist, to your people who are washing your tubes. Everybody, if you are retaining, it's financially great. When I tell this to our CEOs, they are very happy because financially great. What does that mean? That means if you are able to retain a staff with you for the same job, it is documented for 3 continuous years. They say 900 days. If you are doing the same job for 900 days, you become the master or you achieve something called as excellence in that process. Wouldn't you like to have a person like this? So what to do? Invest your energy into retaining such people. Every person, I will say, yes, there will be no 0% staff attrition. There has to be staff attrition because 0 means the lab is shut down. But if your attrition is 40%, then you are abnormal or your organization's, maybe the harmony, something needs to be reworked. But if your attrition is within 5%, that's gold. I mean, you have struck the gold. There is a fantastic intercommunication between your immediate bosses and your staff. The third thing, I think I said about spending time with your staff when they are getting appointed. If you find somebody is, say for example, MBA, whatever, worked in another lab as a marketing manager, then just don't pounce on that person because that person may not be good for your organizational culture. That's why I said spend the time. Number 2 is train the person, empower the person. That's my third point which I will cover up. But train the person adequately and don't jab that person if there is a mistake. Because anyways nobody does it intentionally. The immediate there is a bruise in the heart, once you do it, twice you do it, thrice you do it. I have seen, all of you must have seen, they start looking out. They are not happy. You should get a person who is waking up in the morning and looking forward to come to your lab and say, wow, today I am going. I experienced that, Dr. Bide. Don't, I can see you laughing and the chair is moving actually. So, the third point, what I wanted to say is empower. Empower means what? कौन बोलते हैं? हाँ. Yes. So let's take an example. Good. We explain or we tell them, for example, I will give you this example in a different way, but I agree with you. I have a housekeeper who I have instructed, you do whatever it is. Every patient, because again there is a survey, I am just mixing two topics with talent retention, is across, we did a survey, with Northeast, and because Northeast was something which we wanted to go in, and we saw what was the prime matter of concern from the customer point of view in a healthcare sector. Can anybody tell me what was it? The top on the list. Like I want to have a BMW 7 Series. So what was the prime concern? It was language. Yes. Anybody else? What patients wanted from healthcare? Very good. And in cleanliness? Yes. The number one thing was toilets, dry, clean and non-smelling. So when we got that data, what we did, we across all our labs, we had a webinar and we said let's have a session about how to keep it clean. But coming to empowering, I said my house lady, I said do one thing, I will not ask you what you do, how you do, how you do. These are your resources. Every patient who comes out should have a good experience. I don't want him to tell me that boss, Aparna, your toilet was bad. And we, Suvarna will agree with me, we take a feedback of the patient verbally. They tell us because that is really giving me a feedback. That lady, trust me, is so happy. She comes from 50 kilometers to my lab. Her salary must be what? Nothing. But she is, what she does, she will go to empowering Dr. Mehta. She will go out, she will buy Lifebuoy soap or whatever. She'll go, she'll buy tissues. She will see to it, it is not smelling. So empowering is every level of empowering. It's difficult, it's easy to talk here, but if we do that, it is financially beneficial for our lab. You have other examples like persistence of quality. You will not have outliers in your processes. Let it be pre-analytical, analytical or post-analytical. So I always feel that when you lose one trained employee, let it be at any level. I'm not talking about top doctors or CEOs. You require to pay 20% higher for the next employee, and all of you agree with me that the person is not as good as who you have lost already. So I think what we should do as entrepreneurs or whatever our section heads is try and go back to our desk, put down the list of people who are under us, not the priorities, the list of people, because as it is rightly said, you may have the best place in maybe opposite the station or in Cuff Parade or whichever place. You may have the best, equipments on track systems. You may have the accreditations of CAP and NABL, but all that is useless if you don't have manpower. And I think healthcare is not like any other, I always get to hear this like same chairs, same toilets, same everything. But what about the patients? Demographically, patients are going to be different. It is not like a food chain like a Pizza Hut or a McDonald's where you open the people start coming to buy burgers. You need patients, and for that you need manpower. So I think healthcare is very, very personal or labor, I think intensive people call. I feel it is very, you have to invest in good manpower. Machines will come and go. But what you need to progress, I think every organization which has made a mark in our country, they have a history of good staff retention or lowest staff attrition. So I think I have made an attempt to cover a topic which is not pertaining to anybody of us, but I thought challenges have to be taken, and I can go on for staff retention. There are histories and theories, but these are three things which I feel really can make us very happy, because if you have staff, you can attend conferences. If you don't have, you'll have to rush back and look at the slide. You don't know what they are reporting, whether it is pus-cell or spermatid, you don't know. But if you have good staff, don't lose them. With that, I would like to thank everybody, and I hope I have maintained my time. Thank you.
When you are told to speak after Aparna, it becomes still more difficult because she is such a impressive speaker. But anyway, I will try my best. Friends, my today's topic is how to manage finance in a small and medium-sized lab. I am not here to tell you how to make money. I am just trying to tell you how to raise money and how to use money efficiently. Next slide, please. So what is financial management? It is nothing but raising finance conveniently, fast and economically. It also includes optimal utilization of the finance so raised. Next slide, please. And to check whether the finance so raised can be repaid conveniently and on time without any stress. Now let us see what are the major expenses for which finance can be raised. Next slide. The first and foremost is for the acquiring of the space for the laboratory. This can be either outright or on rent. Second major expense is instrumentation, followed by interiors and working capital. Now coming to real estate. Next, please. Let us see the difference between outright versus leasing of the premises for the laboratory. If you want to purchase premises, especially in city like Mumbai, it is very, very expensive, nothing less than 1.5 crore, 2 crore. And this exorbitant cost may sometime delay starting your own lab. And in case you have made a mistake in choosing location, it is very expensive to sell that and buy new premises, so which is almost impossible. While compared to that, if you are on a lease, normally the lease rent nowadays is around 4 to 6% of the premises cost per annum. And also, as the initial investment is low, it is very easy and less risky to start your own lab. And in case you have made a mistake, you have a flexibility of giving that place back and immediately relocate your premises. Next, please. Now coming to instruments, sometimes you have a dilemma whether to purchase the machine outright or offer the reagent rental offer. The obvious disadvantage of a outright is very high investment, much higher outgo in the form of CMC, AMC and spare parts. But normally these companies offer little lower cost per test. As against that, in reagent rental, there is no initial capex involved. Also, there is no outgo in the form of AMC or expensive spares, but they generally charge little higher cost per test. And if most of these companies will expect a very fairly good amount of workload, if there is any legitimate reason like repeated instrument failure or unavailability of reagent or poor quality of the result, you can always give back the machine, while it is almost impossible if you have purchased your own machine. They will never ever take back the machine. Next. Now coming to source of, the initial fund can be equity or debt. So your own fund, either it is your own self fund or you have taken a partner. While in debt, the money can be raised from the bank, non-banking finance company, private financer, leasing companies or equipment manufacturer. Next. So if you are going to take a partner who will also chip in money, the partner may be a medico or non-medico. Medico partner, either he may be a radiologist or a nursing home owner. The advantage is that there is a synergy between two branches, especially in non-clinical, and the workload of your partner becomes a helping hand in the beginning. Also, their expectation of returns are very well known to the other doctor. So these returns they expect from you are very realistic. But the disadvantage is that they may interfere with you in a day-to-day work, as they know this field very well. While non-medico, their expectation of returns are sometimes very unrealistic or very high. But the advantage is that they will not never interfere in your day-to-day work. Now coming to next, bank finance, either it is a cooperative bank, public bank or private bank. Next. So these are the advantages of cooperative bank. They are adjustable, fast processing, less paperwork. Next. While public government bank, like any other public organization, are very slow, time consuming, more paperwork, but their interest rate is generally the lowest. Next. Private bank, it's a private organization, the processing is very fast, less paperwork, higher interest rate. But friends, one piece of advice, whenever you take a loan from any bank, they will come, the managers will come to you at your busiest time and they will tell you, sir, you just sign, rest I will fill up. Please never do that. Always never sign any blank document. Ask them to fill up everything and then come to you, because many a time a mishap can happen. Next. So while negotiating with bank, you have to keep these points in mind and then bargain with them. Keep in mind, every bank will bargain. These are not a fixed price shops. Many times we doctors feel that bank manager, whatever he has said is the gospel truth, but which is not true. They bargain on each and everything. So you must try on each of these points, you must bargain with them. Interest rate, you must find out whether it is monthly reducing, daily reducing or flat, because the implications of each are different. For equipment, normally the period is 3 to 5 years. Longer the period, it is better, especially if it is a new lab. Bank will give you a moratorium of at least 6 months so that you don't have to pay initially the entire EMI, which will help you, especially if you are starting a new lab. Normally they finance about 70 to 90% of the equipment value. Higher the percentage, it is better because your chipping in becomes less. Regarding processing fees, you must put down your foot that I will not pay processing fees, and most of the time ultimately they will agree. But you have to show that there are many other banks and most of them have told me, so they will ultimately they will agree with you. In stamp duty, normally they will tell you that you have to pay 1% of the loan amount, and when they bring the papers, stamp papers at your place, normally it is on 100 rupees stamp paper. So you have paid few thousand rupees, which goes down the drain. So you must insist that I will pay the stamp duty as per actuals, whatever is the stamp duty paid by the bank. You should insist on removal of any early repayment penalty, because after second or third year you might have some excess fund which you would like to deposit and close your loan account early. Regarding guarantor, try to avoid guarantor, because if you have to take somebody's signature, that means you are taking somebody's favor. And once all this interest rate period, everything is finalized, the bank will tell you your EMI, and you must counter check that by EMI calculators which are available online. Next. This is just one example where you put the loan amount, the term and the interest rate, and it will give you the exact EMI. There are plenty of such calculators available online, so you must counter check with that. Now this is what you have done with the bank. Now it is the bank's turn to find out whether you are a right person to give loan or no. So how will you convince your banker that you are the most eligible customer to avail a loan? Next. Bank is a place that will lend you money if you can prove that you don't really need it. So what the bank will look for in you before giving you a loan, they will look for your qualification, your academic achievement, how confident you are, your grooming, your personality, especially the references and contacts in the same bank and branch, that will also help you. You must have at least a half page or 1 page business plan and strategy noted down, that will help you get loan immediately. If you have any attachment with the hospital, this is taken as assured revenues by the bank and they will immediately give you loan. If there is a guarantor, it will help them. Friends, please make all your credit card payments before you apply for a loan. If there is any credit card payment is pending due to any of your discrepancies or any fight with about the bill or anything, there will be a red line in your credit history. Nowadays everything is online. Every bank with one click can find out your credit history. So don't make a mistake and make all your payments before you put on your application. The private financer generally is on one-to-one contact, no balance sheet, no paperwork, but very high interest rate should be avoidable. Next. Non-banking finance companies generally do a leasing contract. What is the difference between leasing and loan? The leasing company is the owner, so company will claim depreciation. Leasing company will claim depreciation deductible from your taxable income. Generally, the reagent rental contracts are very similar to leasing contracts. And since you are not a owner, there is no risk of any natural calamity in case of fire or flood or anything, because you are not owner of the instrument. While in case of loan, the ownership of the machine is with you. You can claim the EMI is deductible from your taxable income, and you take all the risk about the machine as you are the owner. Next. Sometimes manufacturer is more than eager to sell you the machine. They offer you 50% upfront payment and remaining in the for post-dated checks. Generally, this arrangement is interest-free. There are no paperwork, no balance sheet. And in case of defective or faulty instrument, you have an upper hand for this arrangement. Next. Now, if you are looking at 3-4 machines and you want to find out what is the exact cost of the instrument, you must have a common denominator. So for all the 4 machines, you must do this calculation, which will give you the exact cost of each machine. It should include basic cost of the instrument. You should add either AMC or C. Company is insisting on the UPS, the spares, very important, like bulb, peristaltic tubes, and any other spares which 3 to 4 times in a year. Find out that cost, add that into the cost of the machine. Some of the companies chasing maintenance from them, and these maintenance kits varies from 10,000 to 40,000, which is quite substantial. So when you, and in case some of the instrument needs very high quantity of good quality water, which also is a cost. For machine, then you will get the actual total cost of each of these machines, and after that only you should compare. Next. Now, how to calculate the test? Before this seminar started, I was with few of my colleagues and friends, and I asked them what is the cost of CBC in your lab. So I got the answer varying from 25 rupees, 28, 30 rupees per CBC. So now let us see how correct they are. There are mainly 3 components into a cost of a. One is the reagent cost, another is fixed cost, and third is machine cost. Machine cost instrument is on reagent rental. Next. In reagent, we all know how to calculate cost per reportable test. So we have to include the cost of the test, cost of calibration, cost of, and the cost of repeats. This will give you the cost per reportable test. Next. Now regarding fixed cost, I have just taken an example of a small size lab who is paying a rent of around 20,000 rupees a month, electricity bill around 10,000. Cost of air conditioning is 60 rupees per square feet. So electricity bill around 10,000, telephone 4,000. In salary, 3 technicians at 12,000, 1 receptionist at 10, 1 delivery boy, 1 housekeeping. That comes to around 62,000. Now you add stationery, repair and maintenance, tea, coffee, all miscellaneous. The total cost of running a small lab comes to around 1,05,000. If you consider that the small lab has about 30 patients a day, into 25 days comes to 750 patients a month, and average number of tests per patient we consider 4. Normally it is about 3.5. I have considered 4. So number of tests done in a month is about 2,600. So when you divide this 1,05,000 divided by 2,600, the average cost per test of your fixed cost comes to 40 rupees. And you add cost of syringe needle, it reaches around 44. Friend, most of these corporate labs and big chain of labs have all this, they have a department, they have a lot of people, they do all this analysis, they have all the idea. But individual lab owner, most of the time, they never calculate what is the actual cost per test. So my sincere request is, go back to your lab and calculate your cost per test.
Here, I think the salary to the pathologist to yourself is missing.
So probably now if I remove that, then it will be a loss-making business. So I have purposely removed that. Next, now coming to the machine cost per test. I have taken an example of the CBC 5-part machine. Roughly cost of the 5-part instrument is around 8 lakh. And life of the instrument I have considered as 5 years. More than that is your bonus. So cost per year comes to 1,60,000. Cost of AMC and spares together I have considered as 50,000 a year. So total cost comes to 2,10,000 per year. Divided by 300 working days. So cost of the instrument per day is 700 rupees. And if you are running average 35 CVC per day, your instrument cost itself is coming to 20 rupees. Friends, this calculation will also help you if you are getting a reagent rental offer. Now you must do this calculation and find out for your workload what will be your cost of the machine. You add to the reagent and check whether the company which is offering reagent rental is higher or at lower than this. If it is lower than this, go for reagent rental. If it is higher than this, you outright purchase the one. Next, so if we add up all three, for a cost of CVC, reagent cost is 35 rupees, fixed cost is 44 rupees, instrument cost is 20 rupees, so total cost for CVC comes to 99 rupees. Now this is an eye opener. Even when I was not aware when I did this exercise in my lab, many a time, sometime the charitable organization will come and tell you that आपको तो 20 रुपए में CVC पड़ता है, हमको 30 rupees में कर दो. And most of the time people are tempted and they do it without realizing that your actual cost is much more. Even when you are fixing up your price, your rates for your lab, most of the time what we do is we just call up and find out what is the rate of our colleagues in an area and we keep the same rate. So here also not calculated and you would continue to do the same mistake. So please, all of the pathologists of the area should sit together, calculate this cost and come to a common conclusion and revise the rates. Because the answer I got from my friend was somewhere between 25 to 35 rupees per CBC and here it is coming to around 99 rupees per CBC.
Without your cost.
Without pathologist salary. Regarding I will tell you a little bit about the taxation part. Many pathologists are in dilemma how much of their income should be declared to authority. Now, my suggestion is very simple. Show 100% of this thing, and I will give you the logic why I am telling you to show 100% of your income. Number one, your life will become absolutely stress-free. Number two, you will develop gradually a very good balance sheet. Now when your balance sheet becomes good, you will get a loan, further loan at a much cheaper rate. So forget about the lab premises or the instrument. You want to buy a big house, so there also it will help you. If you are going to a bank to take a loan of 1 crore and your on books your income is very low, in no way anybody can give you a loan. So, and this you cannot increase your balance sheet overnight. So this has to be gradual. So if you start from the beginning, if you are showing all your income on paper, it will help you a lot. Another thing is that your accounting becomes simple. Your staff also knows that everything is on computer, everything is on record. They cannot siphon off anything. Also, you can reduce your tax burden by claiming all legitimate expenses. Many times we don't claim. You can claim the today's conference what you have paid as legitimate expense. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes.
You mentioned about the interest component when we're investing in property, on an instrument or something.
No, I have not got your.
Say you invested 1.5 or 2 crores for the property. Even if you count an interest component of about 10%.
No, that's why I have shown that the lease is always better. Most of the multinational, they start chain of branches. They always go for lease renting. it is definitely a first choice. If you are on a lease, you can start 4 laboratory without any major investment, but you can't even buy 1 premises. For business, you must go for lease. For residence, you must always purchase the premises. Yeah.
So percentage wise, is there any ratio or percentage in which top line to the medical consumable or reagent consumable, as it should be around 20%?
So I mean, see, basically you have to, if you see, like for example, if you are looking at the cost of blood sugar, now your fixed cost of 44 rupees remains same, right? Now, many a time I am surprised, many of the pathologies, they are bargaining with the reagent company from 2 rupees to 1 rupee. Your cost is coming to around 60 rupees. Forget it, you use best of the reagent. It will not affect your bottom line at all. Where you have to concentrate is that 44 rupees and 20 rupees. And not on that 1 rupee and 1.5 rupee. That is the reagent cost is the smallest component of your lab expenses.
Yes. How can you put the kickbacks that you give to your advantage? How do you do it?
I mean, as I said, you show 100% on paper.
Yes.
No, that much you can keep off the paper.
We don't agree that. Yes, Dr. Kunal.
So what do you keep in mind when you're making a profile package? Because when you said the fixed cost per test, when you start making profiles, could you advise on something one should keep in mind?
So profile, basically the advantage that you see is that the person who has come to you for blood sugar gets the diabetic package done. So that is the person who had come to you to spend 150 rupees is going to spend 1000 rupees. So that is where you are winning. So you don't mind giving discount.
So what about?
I'd just like to add what Dr. Kunal said. If you take your total cost, whatever you're spending on fixed cost, salaries, electricity expenses, divide by the number of patients you get, you'll arrive at a figure. I think it will be around 400 to 500 rupees per patient. Now, so any patient who's paying you less than that, that means you're subsidizing his entry into the lab. So idea for profile is what? Idea for profile is that they do more tests. So you cross that 500 rupee mark or 450 rupee mark. So indirectly what happens is he pays you when it comes to you. So many times we feel happy, we आज 50 patient आया diabetes के लिए fasting post lunch, and they all paid you 120 or 160 rupees. In fact, you're doing subsidy for them because your fixed costs are so high that it's like we go to a good restaurant during a match, they will have a cover charge. What's a cover charge? You can come and sit there, but you will be charged 1000 rupees. So we don't have a cover charge. I think it's time we had some type of cover charge. In which you enter my lab, you're going to be charged this much when you do one test or 5 tests.
So if you're many of the machines you're buying, people take 2 years CMC included in the cost of the machine. So what are the experiences? What should be done? Should you take 3 years?
So my first this thing was go for reagent rental. That is the preferred this thing. Purchase only if it is absolutely essential and if the company is not ready to give you on reagent rental.
Purchase will give you depreciation.
No, but you see I have shown you the CBC machine cost as 20 rupees. I am sure if you talk to them between the outright and reagent rental, your reagent cost, suppose on purchase it is 28 rupees, on purchase it is, on RR it is 38 rupees. So still you are saving 10 rupees per CBC.
Dr. Amrish,
Yeah.
you calculated about reagent rental and you showed that if the cost to you, if you buy the machine, it goes beyond that reagent rental cost, per test cost of a reagent rental, then it is better to go for reagent rental. In that you did not calculate the depreciation in that particular cost. So do you really have to calculate using that depreciation?
There are many other things by which you can claim depreciation.
How? Buy a car by yourself.
20% depreciation.
But that is if you get your profit increases. By this, then you are not getting profits only. You are paying everything to the company in the form of machine and
Are you
reagent.
buying for the business or are you buying for depreciation? That is
See, listen, I'll make it clear. See, what happens is if you buy a machine, say 1,000 rupees, I'll just give you a ballpark figure, 1,000 rupees, you'll get a depreciation of 15% or 20% per year. What is depreciation? Depreciation is a tax rate. The money actually you're spending. So you're going to, whether you get a break in the tax or not, that really is a secondary affair. The point is how much money are you going to spend on the test, that is what he has given. So if you're not going to buy the instrument, the entire money is depreciated, 100% depreciation you get on day one. And today if you look at any company, they will, the cost per test, whether it's purchased or rented, I'm sure Dr. Mende will tell you better that the difference is not that big. Secondly, when you buy an instrument, besides the cost what you pay to the company, there is a big tax component. So there is almost a 20%, 15% sales tax, 5% octroi, so many other things. So by the time the machine comes to you, you have paid 20% more in the form of taxes, which is not the case when you buy the rent, because the company that 20% money is straight away saved off.
But sorry, but every company will not give you on rent because now let us look at the newcomer. Now newcomer, they are not going to estimate how much the business is going to give you.
Yeah,
so
then you are no. Yes, some of the companies have started giving, one of the companies which has started giving on fixed lease rent. One of the companies is Roche, and they charge per lakh of rupees certain lease rent, and you can purchase equipment from them without any
commitments.
Yes.
As the previous talk, for every head you require a different technique of shaving. So that is there. People feel that this is a profit-making industry, but being a service industry, we are in a self-employment business. So what we take out is salary and not much of a profit. This everybody has to remember and try and find out what way he can raise the margin of profitability. Thank you very much for the comprehensive talk, Dr. Ramesh. And Dr. Pairaikar, please do us the honors.
A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I am bound in duty to thank the organizers for having invited me. It's always been a pleasure to speak at APPA. See, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take up certain very nice topics today. And as I'm speaking, I'm sure you must be having some doubts in your mind. And if at all you have any doubts, feel free to raise your hand and speak to me about it. I will definitely not get disturbed. And after clarifying, I'll start exactly where I had left you all. So I want it more to be a dialogue than a monologue, because we've got approximately an hour with us. Correct? Am I right? And approximately an hour with us. I would start the whole talk by saying, is medical litigation decreasing or is it increasing is the first question I would like to address. And my answer is very simple. I was a judge on the consumer bench for a long time. Entire Mumbai suburban district was under me. I demitted office, that means I retired in the year 2002. When we sat on the bench and adjudicated, we adjudicated upon all kinds of problems. Medical negligence was one of them. And in 2002, there was approximately one case of medical negligence that we adjudicated in one fortnight. That means around 15 days there was one case. But after practically 14 years, 13, 14 years now, today if you see the board of the same court, there are approximately 3 cases every day on board. That means in a matter of 15 days, there are approximately 45 cases. So in a mere span of 13 years, the incidence has gone up from 1 to 45. See, that is how the leap has come in. And trust me, maybe in another 5 years' time, there might be none of us against whom there is no case of medical negligence. Everybody will have a case of medical negligence. And maybe in another 10 years from now, I may be there, I may not be there, I don't know. But in another 10 years, at cocktail parties like yesterday's cocktail party, the discussion will be, I will say 1 against me, and somebody else will say, I've got 5 against me. You know, the number of cases against you is going to be the criteria or how good your practice is. Better the practice, more the cases. That is something which is going to be very normal. Now, second thing is why my talk becomes very important is, you must have heard about some 3 years back there was a decision given by the Supreme Court that is known as the Amri Hospital case, the Amri Hospital from Calcutta. And the Supreme Court gave a very drastic decision in the sense that the compensation that the hospitals had to pay ran with interest to around 11 crores and the doctors had to pay a couple of lakhs. Now, ever since this particular decision has come in, courts have been a little more large-hearted when it comes to giving compensation. Now, finally, it is not their money. You just give compensation. And finally, we people land up paying a bigger amount as compensation. When I was on the bench, 5 lakhs was the maximum amount we paid. But today, for the drop of the hat, they give you 50 lakhs, 60 lakhs is given just for the drop of the hat. Why does this become important? This becomes important is because all of us are in private practice. Every year we save money so that that money comes to our rescue in our old age. We don't have to ask money from our parents, right? That is how we do it. But today, if at all you have got 2 cases and if both the cases go against you and you pay a large amount of compensation, whatever you have saved for yourself is not going to be there. It will go to run somebody else's house. That is why practice is becoming more and more difficult. And then, well, but we cannot do anything else now except practice. Huh? So we are there we are stuck because all of you are not like me. You know, I've got something alternative to do, but you all do not have it. But then there's nothing to be worried about. Why do I say this? I'm addressing a group of pathologists and I'm saying you don't have to worry. Do you know why? See, if you see the litigation, there are maximum cases against the gynecologist. Gynecologist is on the hit list, first hit list. The second maximum case is against the ophthalmologist. You know, how does litigation come up? Litigation comes up whenever there is a all or none phenomenon. See, in gynec, a woman comes, she delivers and she goes, nothing happens. But if something happens, you either lose the baby or you lose the mother. It is all or none. Even in ophthalmology, same thing happens. The maximum surgery is cataract. Whenever you do a cataract, normally nothing happens. But if something happens, if there is endophthalmitis, you lose the eye. So whenever there is a all or none phenomenon, there is maximum litigation. Which is the specialty where the litigation is minimum, do you know? No. Of late, skin is on the hit list. Aesthetics, you know. So you get high profile patients and they really take you for a ride. That's right. You're right. The litigation with respect to a psychiatrist is absolutely minimum. It is last on the board. Now see, here also there is a very nice thing that I have observed. Suppose the patient is the male and there is some negligence and a male psychiatric patient expires. There is a possibility that the woman will take the psychiatrist to the court. There is a possibility. But if it's the other way around, if the female is a psychiatric patient and if the female dies because of some alleged negligence, the husband will never take the psychiatrist to the court, but the husband will get a new wife. That is what has been observed. He marries again. And he will never bother you, trust me. So that is how it works. And you know who is the last but one? I told you the maximum, I told you the minimum litigation. Who is one step above the minimum? Last but one? Pathologist. So that is the silver lining to this dark cloud. and the silver lining to the dark cloud is that the litigation with respect to pathologists is last but.
Lab run by DMT.
Yeah. Okay, now I'll start. Now that you have asked me, I was not going to take up this issue, but I'll start. Now that you asked me. Let's see. There's a lot of talks going on. We'll do this and we'll do that, vagara. But the thing is very clear. This matter was first decided by the Bombay High Court. Bombay High Court has given a ruling saying that DMT, CMT, they are just technicians, they are not professionals like you and me. A pathologist is a professional, remember, and a pathologist is equally a clinician as a normal physician. Remember this, because based on the reports of the pathologist, it is a clinician who decides. Like, suppose a patient comes in coma, it can be hyper or it can be hypoglycemic coma. So who decides what is to be given? It is a pathologist who decides what is to be given, correct? So he is the one who says that this particular patient has got a hypoglycemic coma, give 10% glucose and the patient comes out, and vice versa. But then a technician can never be a clinician, remember, because he does not have the backup. As a result of it, the High Court came to a conclusion that pathologists can only run the test, and it has always got to be certified person who is a regular MD or a diploma holder in pathology. Now, the government has come out with an ordinance, that's what I am told, correct? Huh? Now the question is, people are saying that we have to challenge this ordinance in the High Court by a writ. That is what the general discussion is. Now, can it be done, and will the High Courts intervene in this, and will the High Courts give you relief is the question. My answer is very simple. The High Court, see, the law is always made by the government, by the assembly. When the assembly is not in session, they bring about an ordinance. But if the assembly is in session, they get it passed and subsequently it is gazetted. Law is always made by you and me through our elected representatives. Now, when can the High Court say that this law is incorrect or this law is correct? But here what happens is, the general belief is that we must go to the High Court, file a writ petition and see that the ordinance passed by the government should be nullified. Am I right? That is what the general belief is. But it is going to be not so easy. When will the High Court nullify a particular law, or when will the High Court nullify a particular ordinance is the question, and the answer is very simple. There is only one situation where the High Court can do it. Otherwise, the High Court itself is bound by the law that the assemblies make. High Court and the Supreme Courts are bound by the law that the Parliament makes. Remember, because these laws are made by the people whom we elect. They are the supreme. High Courts always have got to go within the parameters of the law made by the people. Now, the High Court can strike this law only on one count, and that one count is, if at all this particular law is ultra vires the Constitution of India. And I don't think the ordinance that has been made is ultra vires the Constitution. Means it is violating the principles of the Constitution, the articles of the Constitution. That is why I have my doubts whether the High Court will be able to do it or not. There is a second thing that is being floated, and that is this particular ordinance which has been made has been kept in suspension. Is it true? Huh? And I think there was some discussion with some IMA gentleman yesterday, and he said whether it is in suspension or it is not in suspension, you've got to challenge it in the High Court. Am I right? Yesterday, some Dr. Lele. Huh? Now the question is, whenever we move the court, who moves the court? A person who is aggrieved moves the court. Suppose you people are aggrieved with respect to the ordinance, then you have to move the court. But if at all this particular ordinance is kept suspended, that means it is not effective, then you are not aggrieved. Under the situation, you cannot move the High Court. Correct? So there has got to be a cause of action for you to go to the High Court. And this... No, but the ordinance is suspended. But then it is not in action, na?
Good, it is suspended, so we are agreed.
You are not a pathologist?
I am a pathologist.
You are a CMNT?
No.
Then you are speaking the other way around?
Ordinance was in our favor.
Correct. Yeah. See, wait.
First, there was a GR stating that only pathologists can practice.
No,
In 48 hours, another GR came which said that pathologists and DMLTs both can practice.
No, this I don't know. So
That is why I am saying
I'm
ordinance was in our favor, and the suspension, for the suspension we are agreed.
Yeah, then you mean to say it's because there is suspension over the move then it is possible.
Yes.
No, I didn't know about this. I'm sorry. I didn't know about it. But why was it suspended? Any idea why it was suspended?
Because of their pressure.
It's a lobby.
No. The they have very clearly mentioned in the suspension letter that in the rural areas there are lack of pathologists. That's only reason.
I got the point. Now that means the CMNT people will not move the court.
No, they have not mentioned on suspension letter anywhere.
But then that is what I was just now told.
Or maybe I'm not well informed, I beg your pardon. Maybe I need to see whatever has happened recently. That is what I was just now told, that it has been suspended.
Earlier probably the decision
good ordinance is
that's what
suspended.
we are told.
The good ordinance.
The good ordinance
Yeah.
is suspended.
Yeah, okay. All right. Then I think definitely you all can move the court saying that as to why the reasons, what are the reasons given for suspension? Any idea?
That is
In the rural area.
Acha, there are no pathologists in the
That's what
rural
the
area.
government says.
So in between what had happened when this particular problem took place,
Sir, I would like to make a request. We are trying to have a subject of medico-legal. What we are going into is the legal part, and we have been entangled in this legal part even with Pratap Patil's case since 2007. Whatever we discuss over here, howsoever we discuss over here, it is not going to culminate into something. Culmination will occur only when we come together and put or start moving in a particular direction. Let it be taking some legal action or going for a dharna or whatever might be the thing. But that cannot be decided over here. That has to be decided, if at all, in a special general meeting or a AGM. That is the right platform. I request everyone to please stick to medico-legal aspect and not the legal aspect, because otherwise we are going nowhere. Okay. If everybody agrees, yes.
100%.
Now I will now go into the pure medical area aspects. I told you, pathologist is last but one when it comes to the hit list, the last being the psychiatrist. Now amongst the pathology people, cases where litigation comes up is something that you must understand, and this is only possible by seeing what are the existing cases against pathologists. The commonest case today against the pathologist is HIV reporting. That is the commonest case. And if at all you have reported a patient as HIV negative,
when the patient is HIV positive, there usually is no litigation. Trust me. You have reported the patient as negative, but subsequently it is identified that he is positive, there usually is no litigation. But the other way is very common. You report the patient as positive and subsequently it is identified that this particular patient is HIV negative. Litigation by and large is a rule. Remember, by and large is a rule. So you must always be very careful whenever you report HIV case. And one of the best ways of safeguarding your interest or giving enough ammunition to the advocate who is going to represent you is by putting that disclaimer clause. You know, this disclaimer clause must always be put, saying that this is just a screening test and it has got to be confirmed, vagara, 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 vagara. It has got to be. Now here, whenever the reports are given, there is one thing I want to make it very clear. According to me, it is counterproductive, but some laboratories very much believe in doing it. And this is, they try to explain the report. This is very commonly done by the SRL people. Any SRL people are here? Huh? It is always so. So any one report that they give, and they give a huge explanation as to what that report means and how that report works. Well, academic wise, it is very good. But when it comes to litigation, this kind of the things, according to me, is not very nice, because what you are doing is you are really giving them ammunition to fight against you if at all by chance this particular report happens to be wrong, by chance. But then a lot of laboratories do put it, a lot of laboratories don't put it. But then according to me, a plain simple reporting without explanation but a small disclaimer clause will always help us in the court of law. That is my belief. Now, maybe I'm right, I'm wrong, it really doesn't matter. But when I stand in the courts, this is the heat that I always face. They always use what we have written in the report to fight the case against us. Remember, this is one. Now, second case that invariably goes against us is a wrong reporting when it comes to histopathology. This is another very big branch where there is a lot of problems. Now here, another working problem that we people face is that many laboratories and many senior pathologists are in the habit of giving away the slides and the blocks. How advantageous this is, whether it should be done, whether it should not be done is the question. And I have even discussed this issue with Dr. Chitre, because he was the one who started this particular practice. He was the one who started. So I am of the opinion that some amount of representative slides or some amount of representative blocks must always be preserved by you people, because it always becomes helpful to you. And this, there is one case law which I am going to now quote, wherein the doctor was lucky enough to have the blocks and slides with him, as a result of which he could really win the case. I'll tell you what happened. There was a young girl who was having this particular lump was a small biopsy was taken, and it was identified to be Hodgkin's. Okay, this particular girl was given treatment, but somehow this particular treatment that was given was endoxan. Endoxan damaged the kidneys of the girl, as a result of which the father of the girl donated one of his kidneys to the daughter, and she was carrying on. When this particular problem, the node was not going down, what happened was a re-biopsy was done. And when the re-biopsy was done, it was identified that it was not a Hodgkin's, but it was tuberculosis. You know, both are granulomas. This particular error in diagnosis is one of the well-known things. You know, every pathologist who does histopathology work, especially small tissue biopsies, is very much aware of this particular problem. And then there was a case filed in the court. Now, in the court, the issue was whether the reporting done by the first pathologist was correct or the reporting done by the second pathologist was correct by the time this particular girl expired. That was the case. Now the pathologist said, the first pathologist said, I stand by my report, and then what she did was, she was a lady pathologist, what she did was, she gave the slides and the blocks to the court and asked the court to get it examined by any government organization, any government hospital. The courts sent it to one of the teaching hospitals in the district, and the teaching hospital reported that this particular slide was exactly the way it was reported. There were absolutely no problems in the slide. It was Hodgkin's. Now the courts have always been saying that we doctors are bound by the reports that we give with respect to the slides that we examine, not by a second bunch of slides. Because maybe after subsequently that particular problem might be tuberculosis. But the slide that you have examined was Hodgkin's, and this particular case was won by the doctor. What is the underlying principle here? Underlying principle is, if at all you have the slides which you have reported, you can always show these slides to one of the government institutions and get an opinion from them. That is provided you have the slides with you. But if at all you do not have the slides with you, suppose you have given all the slides and all the blocks, and if at all this particular problem comes up, and then you've got to prove to the court that the slide that you read was correct, and this is the interpretation of the slide, that particular opportunity might be possible only if you keep some slides with you. But then giving away all the slides, according to me, should not be right. You have to keep some representative slides by which you have read, and well, even if you don't have the blocks, it doesn't matter. Now, some people believe in putting an interface between the microscope and a camera, and they preserve the slides in a photographic form. Even that is good, because you can always recall the particular photograph that you have taken, and you can keep it in front of the court and say that this was the slide I saw and I stand by the reports. Correct? Now, second important thing, whenever you are reporting histopathology, there are many senior histopathologists who give a one-line report. You know what I'm saying? One. I've had a discussion with the lady pathologist, senior pathologist, who is a lady, well, that is the way she reports, just one line, that's all. Now, whether these one-line reports is going to help you in the court of law, suppose there is an error in diagnosis tomorrow or not, is the question. Are you understanding me? There is one report that completely describes the slides, and then you come to a conclusion. And there's another report which is just one line diagnosis, that's all. Which amongst the two is good, and which amongst the two should be followed and should be practiced is the question. That is my job, and I will always say that the second report, complete detailed reporting of the slide, and then coming to a diagnosis is always helpful. Why always helpful is the question, and the answer is very simple. Suppose the diagnosis that you have come to is wrong, is erroneous. Okay? Now, what does the courts believe in? What do the courts believe in? Courts always say that a wrong diagnosis which you have arrived at, if at all it is after due application of mind, then an error of diagnosis is not a negligent diagnosis according to the court. So what is important is due application of mind. I can make a mistake, I am a human being, I can make a mistake. But if at all this mistake that I make is after due application of mind, the courts will always clear me, they will give me the benefit of doubt. So in when it is a clinician, application of mind means 4 things. What are those 4 things? First thing is, when I'm a clinician, I've got to take the history of the patient. Second thing is, I've got to examine the patient. The third thing is, I've got to investigate the patient. And the fourth thing is, based on these 3, I've got to come to a conclusion. So, whenever I come to a conclusion with these 4 steps, even if I'm wrong, even if my conclusion is wrong, in the eyes of law, it is an error in diagnosis after due application of mind, and I will always be absolved in law. The law will not hold it against me. Now, as far as the pathology is concerned, what do you mean by error in diagnosis? What do you mean by due application of mind? Due application of mind means you have seen the slide and you have described the slide. You are seeing that the mitotic figures are there, you are seeing the nuclear cytoplasmic ratio is different, all those things. And whenever you describe the slide in that particular manner, and then suppose you have erred, the courts always say that yes, you have applied your mind and you have made a mistake. And whenever you make a mistake after due application of mind, it is always true that your diagnosis will always fall within the ambit of the differential diagnosis. Differential diagnosis was one thing we really didn't like as students to remember them. But in the course of law, differential diagnosis really comes to your rescue, remember. So, you have to fully describe the slide. Now, third very important thing when it comes to reporting, is, I'm on histopathology, is you have got to, if possible, mention on the slide the kind of dye you have used, the staining process. See, hematoxylin eosin is always level 1. Remember, whenever there is a tissue given, it is always level 1, hematoxylin H&E is always done first, and then subsequently you go in for other tests. Other tests, if at all you have done, we always make a mention. But generally, most of the pathologists, what they do is, whenever they use H&E, they never mention that this particular style has been studied by H&E. We always presume that if it is not mentioned, it is always hematoxylin eosin. That is what we presume. Here there was a very nice case that we handled in the court, and we could literally come out of it. I tell you this case, a very beautiful case. There was again a young girl who was having a jugular foramina lump, So she was operated, and they found out that the moment you try to handle that particular lump, the BP was fluctuating of the patient. So they couldn't excise the mass, but they took a small biopsy. The neurosurgeon took a small biopsy and sent it to a pathologist in Kalyan. He's here? No, he's not here. Okay. Okay, it was sent. And the gentleman, the pathologist, examined the slide and gave a report saying that it is a neurofibroma. Okay? Not a sarcoma. Neurofibroma, no malignancy seen. The histopathologist, the surgeon saw the report and the surgeon was satisfied, but somehow the child did not recover. The child started deteriorating, so much so that this particular child from Hiramonji Hospital in Mulund went to Lilavati Hospital, where another neurosurgeon by the name of Dr. Atul Goel reopened the patient. And here what he did is, he took up a second biopsy, and here what happened, Lilavati Hospital got the tissue examined by immunohistochemistry. IHC was done. Subsequently, the IHC report showed that there was malignancy. Okay? And then the child further started deteriorating. Lilavati Hospital said, you'll have to go to Tata. This particular child was then taken to Tata. And the Tata people opened the patient for the third time, and again they studied the patients. They took another biopsy, studied it by immunohistochemistry. They also came to the conclusion that there was malignancy. Now there was a problem. The first report is saying that there is no malignancy, and the same tumor, the second and the third institution is saying there is malignancy, and this particular doctor had to be defended. So what was the only solution that was left to us was, well, initially the test that was done was using a H&E staining. Subsequently, IHC or immunohistochemistry was used. Now, immunohistochemistry gives you much more information, as the result of which a report that is obtained by IHC can never be compared to the report that is being obtained by H&E. Are you following me? Well, I still remember I was the one who argued this matter in the court. The court just couldn't understand what I was saying. Both are histopathology, both are staining, both are microscopic diagnosis. So how is it possible that you missed cancer was the question. And then, courts are manned by lay people. There are no doctors there, absolutely lay people. So you've got to put it across to them in a manner that they understand. So I gave them a very simple example. I've got spine problems. I've got a severe backache with tingling numbness in my legs. I go to an orthopedic surgeon, and the orthopedic surgeon will always refer me to a radiologist. And the first test that the orthopedic surgeon refers me is a plain simple lumbosacral spine AP lateral. That is what is always done. AP lateral spine is done, and subsequently what happens is it is absolutely normal. You come back to the orthopedic surgeon. Orthopedic surgeon said that, well, it is normal, and then he refers me to level 2 studies, that is either a CT scan or a MRI, correct? Na? And when you do a MRI of the same spine, MRI will give you totally different picture and a different kind of a information. See, this is the explanation that was given to the court to make them understand what I was saying. So radiology examination of the same spine, but on plain X-ray spine, you get limited information. But the same spine, when it is subjected to a MRI, the kind of information you get is something much more. Now what is the difference? The difference is MRI is more time consuming and MRI is costlier. Remember? But that is not so with a X-ray lumbosacral spine X-ray. Then the court understood, yes, what you are saying is correct. Then I applied the same logic here. Now here what happens is immunohistochemistry is more time consuming, immunohistochemistry is more expensive than a plain simple H&E studies. So the court understood and we won the case. Here there was one question that the court asked, which was a very tricky question. And that question was, why did you yourself, suo motu, did not subject this particular tissue to immunohistochemistry? Are you understanding what I am saying? The court said, you should have done an immunohistochemistry. Who prevented you from doing it? At that point of time, the explanation I gave was, a radiologist, when he takes an X-ray lumbosacral spine, will he directly subject the patient to an MRI? Yes or no? Answer is no. Who advises MRI? It is always the clinician who advises MRI. So here also, you study the matter, study the tissue by H&E, you give the report. It is for the clinician to ask you to subject this particular tissue to immunohistochemistry. Are you following me? So if the clinician is going to accept the report that I have given, you cannot hold the pathologist accountable for something that the clinician has not advised us. We cannot per se subject the tissue for MRI, for immunohistochemistry, because if at all it is done and if at all it turns out to be normal, you know what the court say? Just because you want more money from the patient, you have subjected it. So never ever do it. Ask the clinician. You can always put a rider below. It is advisable that the tissue is studied by immunohistochemistry. Are you all following what I am saying? Yeah. So this is normally how it is done. Now the problem is not that. Histopathology examinations, the litigation with respect to pathologies is maximum here. And here what happens is, for the reports given by the pathologist, it is the clinician who invariably lands into trouble. Invariably. I'll give you a very simple test, a very simple issue. You go in for an FNAC of the breast, you say that malignant cells are seen, and then the patient is directly taken up for the table and a radical mastectomy is done, and subsequently when the breast is removed and subjected to histopathology examination, well, there is no malignancy. These cases have happened, and whenever such cases have happened, you know, for a person who is totally behind the scene, the pathologist is always behind the scene. Many a times the pathologist is not even taken to the court. It is the clinician and the hospital authorities that land up paying compensation. This is a very common problem, and this problem takes place when, you know, this problem takes place when you refer the slides for a ER/PR studies to Tata. Whenever you say the patient should be referred to ER/PR for evaluation to Tata, they always call for the slides, and when they call for the slides, they say, "Isme to cancer dikhta hi nahi," and then the problem starts. Because remember, if a young lady loses her breast and later on it is identified that the breast was removed without malignancy being actually present, then it becomes a very serious problem. So pure FNAC reporting is dangerous. Once upon a time when we were students, the rule was very simple. A negative FNAC does not rule out cancer, but a positive FNAC is always diagnostic of cancer. That is what we people were taught. But today that is not the thing. Today we always go in for something known as a true cut biopsy. Remember, you people must be knowing what I am saying. So it is always, whenever there is an FNAC report which is positive for cancer, always put a disclaimer, advise true cut biopsy. Put it down. Maybe tomorrow, if at all that particular report is wrong, you will always be saved because you have always mentioned below that going for a true cut biopsy is very, very nice thing to put. It really saves you. And the clinician also becomes a little more careful because when some consultant puts it on paper, then he has got to go by what the consultant says. Otherwise, the baby is going to be in his lap permanently. Are you following me? That's the way you save yourself.
Question is, can a pathologist give prescription? Answer is, what the pathologist has got to do, whatever report that is to be done, this report which most of us don't do, this report is not to be discussed with the patient. This report is to be put in an envelope, sealed and addressed to the consultant who has referred the patient to. So giving the question of giving prescription, according to me, does not come. Neither giving advice on the report. This is the practice that is followed in the UK. If you see the UK pathologists, they will give the report, put it in a sealed envelope, seal it and address it to the referring consultant, and it is for the consultant to decipher the reports. The pathologist usually does not discuss it. That is why the reports are always dispatched by the receptionist and not by the doctor. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It was very entertaining.
So thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And I would ask Dr. Siddharth Gavaskar to give a small memento to Dr. Gopinath Shenoy. Thank you, sir. Thank you for such a enriching lecture, and we stop here.